I'm John Wibby, and I'm associate professor at Northeastern University, and really thrilled to be hosting today. I know typically it's Bryony or Matt or David who host, um, but let me go ahead and introduce our speaker in just a second. I do want to preview some of the events that are coming up. Uh, so this spring we have a really wonderful group of guests to follow. Alicia Wanless. And those include Kai Kupferschmidt, who's going to be talking about dilemmas of covering a field, reporting on misinformation research. That'll be March 12th. Samantha Bradshaw uh, and Dan Williams, who's going to talk about misinformation in science and society. So a big focus on science, understanding how science is communicated, and misinformation related issues there. I'll put those in the chat so everybody has that. Um, Okay. Um, but without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. And I am a huge fan, by the way, of Alicia's research, and her new book is absolutely fantastic. So I want to recommend it to everyone. Full bio, Dr. Alicia Wanless is the director of the Information Environment Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which aims to foster evidence-based policy making. Alicia is the author of The Information Animal, Humans, Technology, and the Competition for Reality, released last year. And she was a technical advisor to Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder, a quite influential project, and is a founding member of the Global Cybersecurity Group. Alicia is a visiting researcher at the Institute for Digital Security and Behaviour in the University of Bath School of Management at King's College London in war studies. She completed her PhD combining strategic theory and ecology and a new approach to understanding conflict within the information environment. So without further ado, Dr. Wanless, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. That's a high bar you set, so hopefully this lives up to it. There are a couple of things I think you guys might want to know about me before I start. The first is, if I can get my slides to work, the first thing is the weirdness of my slides. I repurpose a lot of old propaganda for my slides, and I've been messing with Gemini, leaving the silly things it creates in my presentations, mostly because it entertains me and I feel it's a little bit subversive given all the claims. And then the second thing, as you know already, I run the Information Environment Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where I've been for the last 6 years. The project fosters ways of understanding information ecosystems to inform policymaking about them. Now, I would like to ask you guys a few questions, and Libby's helped me. There is a poll, so we will get those up. I can't see it, so Libby will have to. Oh, look, I can see the thing. We'll see what the results are. The first thing is, if I move that out of my way. Does anyone here feel like politics is more polarized? The second question, do you know someone who thinks the media is biased? And lastly, do you know someone whose sense of reality is completely at odds with yours? Maybe it's on vaccines or government overreach.
So we have 96% yes on poll one.
That's pretty bad
Okay.
enough that everybody's feeling that way, and no big surprise. Welcome to the throes of an information competition. Some of us might be actively participating in it, but all of us are living through it. The information competition I'm talking about, oh, there we go. The information competition I'm talking about is escalating and playing out across many democracies each in their own way. The information competition we're experiencing has been building for decades. On the one hand, we have a conservative worldview that believes that media, education, and bureaucracies have been captured by progressive ideas, and in trying to reclaim them, undermines trust in those public institutions. On the other hand, is a progressive worldview fighting on behalf of various groups for social rights, often focusing on the discriminatory nature of the same institutions and in a different way undermines them. Both sides try to inform policy and legislation. The competition between them often plays out online and over how digital platforms should moderate content. Viewed from either side, both engage in attempts to censor or control information. Competition can be a good thing. It leads to innovation. Problems arise, though, when two sides can no longer come to constructive shared conclusions or divisions between them descend into open animosity. Then it becomes a challenge for democracy. What I hope to share with you today are insights on how information competition in the context of information ecosystems and how an ecological approach can help us understand both better. Here's my three-point plan of attack. First, I'll cover some key concepts. Then I'll provide one historic example and why it matters today. I'll be talking about Canada in the modern day context. And then I'll share an inspiration in ecology to help understand conflicts. So Act 1. Throughout this talk, I'll be using terms that might be new or different for you. These are all concepts I explore in the book, so you can always dig deeper later. The first key concept is information competition. This happens when two or more communities compete to have their worldviews adopted by the wider public. To win hearts and minds, competitors use available means to communicate their ideas to audiences, sometimes flooding and polluting an information ecosystem to try and dominate their opponent. In this sense, information competition can be understood along a scale. At one end of the spectrum, everyone in an ecosystem holds the same beliefs. In a large and diverse country, this level of groupthink is neither likely nor desirable. The next state would be coexistence, where beliefs are different but not mutually exclusive, and compromises can still be found between parties. This is most likely the place where you want democracy to be sitting. When two beliefs become mutually exclusive and competitors escalate influence operations, information confrontation begins. So, for example, this happened when two fundamentally opposing ideas in abolition and slavery were the focus of competition in the United States before the Civil War. Information competition escalates into conflict when two or more sides can no longer reconcile their different perspectives and they frame each other in derogatory stereotypes. Both information confrontation and conflict can endure for a long time, but they can also escalate into violence and ultimately war. As such, escalating information competition is a precursor to war, but to paraphrase Clausewitz, our two wrestlers strive with informational force instead of physical violence to compel the other to submit to his will. This is like a duel where they dynamically respond to each other. The phenomenon is nothing new. Information competitions have been around since the dawn of history, as have information ecosystems, which is our second key concept. And here, I'm really sorry, but this calls for some definitions as we're dealing with some terms that are often inconsistently applied. For example, information environment and ecosystem are often used interchangeably, and depending on who uses which term, they often mean something slightly different. A lot of people using information ecosystem to mean the internet or social media. Some might mean news media, and elsewhere it's a stand-in for an organization like a business. They're not wrong in that these are all types of information ecosystems, but something a bit more expansive would help connect different disciplines and research better. Leaning into physical ecology, David Scales, Claire Wardle, and I, in a forthcoming paper, suggest that the global information environment, which is singular, not plural, comprises the external conditions that enable information to exist, such as economy, governance, electricity, and transportation. Whereas information ecosystems are integrated systems forming from relationships between humans, tools, and the outputs that are created using those tools and the surrounding environment. Information ecosystems have existed since people learned how to communicate, beginning with gestures. People developed language, a tool that they could speak and output to share ideas. And from there, every new tool like the alphabet led to more outputs like letters, with each innovation adding more complexity to the information ecosystem where they were introduced. All the way up to today, where so much of our communications relies on the internet and the complex digital system underpinning it, not to mention electricity. Things like language and writing haven't disappeared, they simply remain the basis for most of the means and outputs we have for communicating today. However, the more a society relies on digital technology to produce, share, and store most of its outputs for nearly every aspect of daily life, from economy to healthcare to travel, the more inherently fragile that information ecosystem becomes. And that's becoming more and more apparent with every subsequent cloud outage. And while each layer of technology introduces additional vulnerabilities, these tools themselves do not exist in a void. At best, they're like a connective tissue. If humans don't know how to use them, these tools are meaningless. Yet human ability to use these tools is based on learning, derived mostly from outputs produced using those same tools. So information ecosystems are complex and dynamic with many overlapping feedback loops. The more people, the more tools, the more outputs, the greater the complexity and thus fragility of an information ecosystem. Information ecosystems come in many forms, including those that are tool or output specific, like the ones on social media or news media I mentioned earlier. Information ecosystems can be virtual, forming between scholars sharing ideas and letters that spawn the Renaissance in Europe. They can be closed and controlled like Sparta, leaving mostly just an idea behind about their austerity and fighting prowess. And information ecosystems can be sprawling and diverse, formed by laws and geography like Ukraine. But virtual, big or small, every information ecosystem consists of people, tools, and outputs connected through interrelationships and bound by a shared idea or concept like a religion, identity, or a nation state. So in this way, information ecosystems emerge from a wider space. All information ecosystems exist within a global information environment. The information ecosystem that you're in right now, which I'm assuming most of you are in Massachusetts, doesn't exist in isolation. No information ecosystem does. It sits within a wider North American information ecosystem surrounded by others like that of Canada. The other people that are part of this information ecosystem are also part of other information ecosystems. In fact, you're all sitting in a different information ecosystem from me, and you might be talking to other people on your devices who are elsewhere in other ecosystems as well. In a globalized world with so much traffic, both physical and digital, moving between countries, national information ecosystems are shaped by domestic conditions, but also by conditions in other countries. Because information ecosystems are dynamic, they're also constantly changing. Populations fluctuate, skills for processing information shift, resources shape what tools develop, which in turn changes the types of outputs available. But there are patterns to these shifts that in information ecosystems occurring before an information competition erupts into conflict. I've found these patterns across 5 historic cases from ancient Greece to today. But let's change gears and I'll tell you a story for Act 2. It draws on one historic example from my book because it keeps coming back to me, especially when I'm thinking about the US today. It involves a man with serious personality problems who wanted to be an autocrat. If you don't know this man, please allow me to introduce you to the OG King Charles. He's deeply flawed, he's very temperamental, he's never meant to govern, but his brother dies. He inherits new and growing colonies from his father James, who chartered the Virginia Company, which in turn spawns a class of rich merchants who increasingly enter public life. He's also only the second person to rule England, Scotland, and Ireland. And while these countries are separate, they impact each other, as we'll see. James also ends a war with Spain, resulting in an exodus of aristocrats for the first time in generations, including Charles, who heads off to Spain in a disastrous attempt to find a wife. This all helps open the English information ecosystem up to a wider information environment and inflowed information as a result, but maybe not always of the most helpful kind. By the time Charles comes to power in 1625, Europe is gripped by the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics. Propaganda pamphlets flow in to agitate the English Protestants to support their continental brethren. These pamphlets spread a conspiracy theory that the Vatican is leading a global effort to drag England back into the Catholic faith. And what's worse, the Pope is actually the Antichrist. This sort of propaganda resonates with a group of ultra-religious Protestants in England, pejoratively called the godly, who always felt that the Reformation there never really went far enough. The godly constantly petitioned their monarchs to make more reforms, even publishing a pamphlet playbook to help others get in on the advocacy. Now, these petitions and pamphlets have a wider market thanks to the Reformation. After all, Protestants believe in a more direct engagement with the Bible, which requires literacy. In fact, the Bible becomes a great place to keep those popish fears alive, drawing on past events. That Spanish Armada in 1588, or the Catholic-led plot to blow up Parliament and Charles's father in 1605, these are all still living on in memory. So now more people can read in Charles's England than ever before, including apprentices who must be literate to enter a trade. But there's also more people in general, because the English population just gets back to pre-Black Death numbers around Charles's reign, which is great for the domestic printing market that's finally taking off. It was a bit delayed because it took quite a while for the domestic paper industry to really get on the ball. But these printers have a business model problem. They want to make money, so they print what people want, which is often low-quality content that doesn't really encourage much sound reasoning. Let's call this information pollution. They publish what sells: horror stories about human deformities, monsters, and murders, things that induce fear and anger, things that spread. Never has it been easier to print as fast and as much as they can now. These pamphlets start to respond to each other in what feels like real time. Arguments over religious reforms play out in them, as does satire mocking those arguments. And of course, there are complaints that the godly are imposing their way of life too much on the wider public. Handwritten newsletters are still a major feature of information flow, but now for the first time, newspapers in Toronto's emerge. And of course, we have books in such newfound plenty that Robert Burton complains about the chaos and confusion of them, how they're hurting his eyes from reading and his fingers from turning the pages. There's just so much information out there, it's too much to get a handle on. And in this changing information ecosystem comes Charles, inept and petulant. He pisses both the Parliament and merchants off by imposing heavy taxes, the likes of which suggest he would deprive people of property or freedom without justification, which goes against rights they've had since the Magna Carta. And instead of accepting their complaints and due rights, Charles throws a tantrum and just does away with Parliament for like a decade. Fake it as that divine ordained despot until you make it, right? He forces the gentry to go manage their estates instead of living in London, further cutting him off from a feedback loop between the people and him. He continues to alienate the gentry more by surrounding himself with his favorites. Charles fuels the apocalyptic fears of the godly by marrying a French Catholic, letting her practice her faith pretty publicly, and then making religious reforms that seem, well, fairly Catholic to the godly. In Scotland, he pushes his new prayer book, and the Protestant zealots there go next level, rioting in a church, pumping propaganda into England to provoke the godly, and ultimately going to war with the king. And from here, it just spirals. The parliamentarians cajole the literate public to petition the king. They agitate the apprentices to protest and riot. These guys are basically incels. They can't marry until they're 24. Meanwhile, Charles does what a lot of leaders feeling threatened might do. He tries to control the flow of information, often using the court of the Star Chamber here to do so, which is not very democratic. After a complaint from the Spanish ambassador, for example, he bans all Corantos, and he makes it illegal to spread all rumors and slander about himself and his wife. In one infamous event, Charles has the executioner publicly burn a book critiquing theatrical plays which the Queen liked to stage, and has the ears of the author William Prynne cut off. Charles controls the number of printing presses in England and the volume of editions that are printed within that country, but not Scotland. But try as he might, he can't stem the flow of propaganda from abroad or domestic politicians from using it for their own gain. Yet at the same time, Tude introduces the first postal system in 1635, which helps move information around the country faster. Popish plots flood the information ecosystem. There's dozens of Catholic conspiracies in the press in late 1641 and early 1642. Things like a French fleet raise panic, and people suggest that the Queen is planning to overthrow the king with financing from the Pope. These outlandish conspiracies surge in response to events like the introduction of the Common Prayer Book in Scotland I mentioned, the dissolution of the Short Parliament, and the Irish Rebellion, to name a few. Like today, scandals, plots, and impending doom attracts readership in an information ecosystem where instability and concerns for the future are clearly present, something we're likely to experience a lot more of. And for their part, Charles and his supporters wake up very late in the information competition with the parliamentarians and godly of all stripes. They gift the world cavalier poetry about honor, sexuality, drinking, and whatnot, the antithesis to the godly propaganda. Long story short, it didn't work, and Charles lost his head. Now, in case I put you to sleep with my love of details here, this is the TLDR. Across all my historic case studies, those information ecosystems experienced the following shifts. In resources. In England, economic shifts led to a new class of merchants creating conditions to support innovation and the parliamentarians. In tools, there were new innovations that changed how information was processed and distributed from paper to print to the postal service. This increased the volume of outputs along with the speed and distance those outputs could be moved. More people engaged in the growing public sphere thanks to literacy, population growths, and an opening of the English information ecosystem. And lastly, new ideas emerged that challenged existing ones. The Reformation challenged Catholicism, and Charles pushing for absolutism challenged the limitations of the crown, which in turn spawned a reaction that led to new ideas about the public sphere. This then sparked an information competition between two communities who sought to have their views adopted by the wider public. This was between the godly parliamentarian cohort and the Cavaliers. These factors changed in the information ecosystem leading up to the English Civil War, as they did before the Peloponnesian War, the American Civil War, the fight for Vietnamese independence, and Ukraine before 2014. So it is possible that information competition is a natural disturbance occurring under certain conditions that change within an information ecosystem. But why does this matter today? Because globally, many democracies like Canada have been experiencing similar shifts. Canada has an economic problem, even if it's just in the minds of Canadians. We've been struggling here since the plague, but the tariff threat is making things worse. 79% of Canadians now believe they're in a recession. These economic shifts make it harder for people to cope with changes in the information ecosystem. For example, Canadians experiencing financial hardship are more likely to have lower trust in public institutions than those that aren't, and over 2/3 have lower levels of trust in the news media. New innovations are changing how information is processed and distributed, starting with cable TV ushering in that 24/7 news cycle, followed by the internet, social media, and now AI. These innovations have come in a much more rapid succession than did printing, writing, the telegraph, or even radio. What's also different is that most governments outside the US have little control over those new means like social media. And in some cases, like in Canada, they have huge market shares. There's also shifts in demographics. Adult literacy levels in countries like Canada are challenged. At the same time, more people are engaging in politics on social media. And the demographics are changing. 23% of the population are now immigrants. It's the highest since our Confederation in 1867. And there are Canadians who are unhappy with those demographic shifts. And these are facts our neighbors like to exploit. New ideas around social rights are challenging conservative views, and that information competition between them, at least here in Canada, has only been tempered by Trump's interference. But this is all happening while our local and independent media is dying, and 2.5 million Canadians have almost no local news, and more people are turning to influencers as news sources, including in the top 10 were mostly leading American conservative figures. What's more, we have Canadians so exposed to the American information ecosystem that they've confused their laws with ours. Here's an example from a court case of protesters who were involved in a protest in Ottawa a couple of years ago, referencing the First Amendment of the US Constitution as his right as a Canadian. Just because you guys aren't likely to be Canadian, we don't have that. In this interplay between changing factors, between resources, tools, demographics, and outputs, that's why we have to look at them all together as an information ecosystem and not just in their component parts. This context is needed to understand information competition. Now, as this can feel a little overwhelming and sometimes depressing, I'd like to leave you with a bit of inspiration for Act 3. While studying information ecosystems might seem complex, there is a model in physical ecology. And if there are any ecologists listening, consider this my PSA and apology off the top for what is going to be a very gross oversimplification of your field. Ecology is the study of the relationships between living organisms, including humans, and their physical environment. It's a field that structures work from many disciplines, including botany and zoology, to form an understanding of the environment. Before the field of ecology developed, scientists saw the environment as mechanistic, animals as machines, and humans as separate from the natural world. Scientists studied parts of the environment, like plants and animals, separately from the system where they exist. That changed when Prussian naturalist Alexander von Humboldt sets out for South America in 1799. He ultimately puts forward an understanding of physical ecosystems as a delicate web of life. He saw that the human clearing of forests around Lake Valencia was killing the lake. Those trees stop soil erosion and moderate the temperature. Removing those trees kills the system, a system that humans depend on to survive. Humboldt started to document factors within ecosystems, logging the types of plants, the elevations they grow at, and temperatures globally. Over the last 200 years, consistent measurements of the same things around the world and a bridging of various disciplines has given us an understanding of how ecosystems like forests, lakes, and tundra work. We now know how they change over time, what makes them resilient, and ultimately what kills them. Right now, though, research on the information environment is a lot like understanding of the physical environment before Humboldt's breakthrough. The information environment, if it's thought of at all today, is seen as something apart from humans and mechanistic. We look at it in separate pieces, primarily a bit of technology here or a type of content there. We haven't really found those equivalent measurements to air temperature or water level that ecologists have. Heck, we haven't even agreed on shared definitions. In not understanding information ecosystems, there is a strong chance we are intervening in ways that backfire, much like clear-cutting forests kills the very ecosystem people hope to grow things in. Except in this instance, societies and systems like democracy are at risk. So what's to be done? Well, first, instead of jumping into action, it's time to step back and see the system. I believe that's where the answers can be found in what makes a healthy information ecosystem. To get there, we need to borrow more than just analogies from physical ecology. We can learn from how they organize research between the structure of ecosystems and living and non-living components, and the functions within ecosystems like food chains and nutrient cycling. In a similar approach, we might discover that we have a lot of case studies that look at specific types of outputs or tools, but we lack global measurements of factors that provides insight into the types of information ecosystems that exists. Or we might be missing research on functions within information ecosystems, like how those factors interrelate or the processes behind information webs. This can help us find the gaps that need filling. If we want to understand information ecosystems, we need to follow Humboldt in measuring the same factors consistently across ecosystems globally. That includes things like population size, diversity, and adult skill level, as well as infrastructure, available services and outputs, and ownership of these things. We can also borrow how processes are studied from physical ecology. For example, ecologists study the relationships between organisms like mutualism and parasitism to understand food webs. A similar approach might help us better understand information webs and competition. For example, printers in early modern Britain needed profits to survive, while parliamentarians of the king wanted their message published. Working together is mutualism. They mutually benefit in performing their functions together, and in some cases, printers printed both sides. At the same time, this drive for profit set the course for the English language, with printers choosing a dialect from the middle of the country to be understood as widely as possible. The dynamics of these relationships shape the factors of information ecosystems. Feeding people a steady diet of information pollution, because that's what sells, is like parasitism. The purveyor profits while the minds of the consumers degrade. Given that there has always been a market for trashy content, banning it isn't likely to make it go away, but that doesn't mean that purveyors should have the right to use recommender systems or targeted advertising to make it spread. Of course, while parasites aren't fun in the physical world, those in the information environment are self-aware and don't just stop at siphoning their hosts, but can shape the information ecosystem where they operate to foster conditions favorable to themselves. This is also why it's not enough to borrow analogies from physical ecology, but why we need to actually study how those types of relationships evolve over time in information ecosystems. In the physical world, these relationships shape evolution, which is the process of struggle and adaptation that leads to the survival of a species. Competitors continuously adapt in juxtaposition to each other, much like Clausewitz's idea on the constant dynamic interaction of adversaries. Success is measured in endurance, staying alive long enough to spawn. In the case of information competition, it's the adoption and spread of ideas. To achieve that, competitors adapt to and work within an information ecosystem, knowingly or otherwise, trying to dominate the ideas of their opponents. And to achieve that, competitors adapt to, yet often research on information competition looks at specific campaigns in isolation, the tactics and messaging of a singular actor type, for example, in foreign interference. But in every information competition, there are at least two opponents operating in relation to each other, but also within the confines of an information ecosystem. That's why that dynamism and the context that are missing, we need to start to look at that and put them into the context where they exist. So I encourage anyone on here who might be researching a campaign to step back and situate their work in at least a basic understanding of the information ecosystem where it's happening and in relation to whomever it is opposing. But for those working on something different, one way we can start down this path is to begin thinking about how our own work fits into information ecology. It might be a function, a process like communications, or on a tool like AI, but putting it into context can help us get to a wider field fit for understanding the information environment. Not everybody's going to walk away and decide to study information ecosystems, but I hope that some of you will at least have a better understanding of how your work might fit into that bigger idea. And more specifically, there are many ways to contribute. Conducting consistent and repeated measurements of the same factors across information ecosystems can help us identify types of ecosystems and build an understanding of a global information environment. In analyzing those repeated measurements in the context of a complex system, we can also uncover the relationships between factors. For example, how do things like changing demographics, literacy levels, available ICT services, and the kinds of outputs consumed interrelate with each other? And then using those outputs from all that work, we can begin to model information ecosystems much like ecologists have in the physical world. Now, none of this is going to be achieved by a single researcher or even a small group of them. It takes a field bridging many existing methods and disciplines together to make sense of the information environment, such that it can inform policy and help us foster the right conditions to support systems like democracy. And here again, Humboldt does inspire. He went on to correspond with hundreds of scientists across fields to articulate an understanding of nature and cosmos. That gives me hope that together we can do something similar for the information environment and ultimately better understand the role of information competition within ecosystems. And for anybody who'd like to dig deeper on these topics, there's a couple of things. One is a report on assessing national information ecosystems, and of course, the book that John kindly mentioned. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. That was absolutely wonderful, and the gifs from the Renaissance or wherever, what we would call the Enlightenment, or were just like amazing. All these like woodcuts coming to life, and yeah,
What you
but
couldn't hear is that there's sound, and it makes up sound, and I don't ask it to, and some of it
yeah,
is absolutely off base, almost always with an American accent if there
yeah.
is not a specification for something else.
I loved it. I really loved it. Let's open it up to questions. Always, I will try to curate the questions, so please feel free to put them in there. But maybe a prerogative of the moderator. I'll start off. I was trying to think about the ecosystem analogy, which you really wonderfully articulate and unpack. And I was wondering, is there some equivalent to human-induced climate change? In other words, some uh, large external factor which has these sort of downstream effects. I don't know what that would be, but I was just sort of trying to unpack the metaphor and think about it. Is there some large factor in that way? Or maybe it's a set of factors. Maybe it's a set of climate changes that you see.
So again, I don't have all the answers at this point, having only got a few case studies down.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's a few differences. One is that the information environment doesn't exist without us, right? Like it only exists because that is how we make a shared understanding of the world. So that's one qualitative difference. Like the physical environment could go on living probably pretty happily without us. So our interference within the physical world is grossly disbalanced or imbalanced versus who and what we are within it. Whereas in the information environment, we are very much central to it, which kind of shapes that nature. I think that digital technologies, broadly speaking, could be seen as that kind of more major shift than prior technology. And then the second thing is, I think that because it is so interlinked, as layers itself, and then dependent on electricity, which I think is the most overlooked aspect of our very complex modern information ecosystems. Because if it starts to fail, everything goes down with it. I think that kind of is the large overlooked elephant in the room. It doesn't necessarily shape the ecosystem itself, but the dependency on it, I think, really creates a very large vulnerability.
Oh, that makes complete sense. We're starting to have some questions roll in, so I will read those to you. The first is from Anne. Could you comment on the ecosystem's change or imbalance vis-a-vis, or for example, Fox News versus the absence of newspapers as the go-to place for information and opinion?
I'm not sure I will have a specific answer for that because I haven't studied the modern American information ecosystem to check those changes.
Yeah.
I think that generally speaking, there does seem to be some evidence that cable news has had a bigger influence on policymaking in the US recently. I can't remember where I saw that study, but somebody else has done better work on that than I have. Um, and I think what happens is you end up with different forms of media that are getting attention at different times. But I think one of the challenges here is that because we're looking at them in pieces, we don't necessarily know how they're working in terms of a system. So for a while, everybody was worried about social media. Then an election comes around, and then it was podcasts that everybody was talking about. And then another study comes out and says that it's actually cable television. It's likely a mix of all of these things. So that's not a satisfying answer, Anne. I would look to more media studies persons than war studies persons to get help there.
Next question from Robert. I'm looking for a measurement tool for the quote impact of a news story. Clicks, time on site, referrals don't measure if someone changed their mind or moved to action, which seems like a more valid measurement. Have you found any tools that work faster than elections?
Again, I'm not really working at that level of research. I think this is again like an issue where trying to measure the impact of a specific type of content is really challenging. I mean, I used to work in strategic communications a long time ago, and the whole idea of whether your campaign was actually achieving the outcome that you'd hoped in terms of people taking the action that you wanted, the campaign had to be so perfectly designed that this was like really the only thing that they would be looking at, and they'd have to be doing the exact action that you wanted them to do to be able to track that and say concretely that what you did had the effect that you were hoping for. So sorry, Rob. There's no easy answer there.
Next question from Sam. I think post-Reformation England is an interesting comparison, but the difference I feel like we're facing, I guess now, is another ecological variable, time and decomposition rate. The attention deficit and rapidity with which we consume information is not really comparable. Do you think that we're not really, quote, consuming information the same way it was even a few decades ago?
Yeah, I think that's right. We're receiving more and more information all the time from different sources. Even my ability to tell you studies, I feel like is hindered because I rely too much on outsourced memory to be able to tell me things. So I think that there's a real significant challenge in terms of how we're consuming information, how long we're storing it, and then how the tools that we have available to us, not just for storage, but for answering questions, are impacting human cognition over time. I think these are um, really important issues that are impacting at least this ecosystem and your ecosystem for sure. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that the English Reformation period is one to one, but there were similar shifts, and typically these shifts are occurring in advance of some sort of civil conflict or war, which is not going to be overly reassuring in the current period.
Next question from Anonymous. Does the speed, erratic nature, and immediate detriment of social media driven by singular, sinister agendas present an unprecedented risk to the global information ecosystem? Can there be a counterbalance?
I mean, I think that it's clear that large interconnected tools that cross various information ecosystems and the ideas that can be spread through them can definitely present a challenge. Um, Unprecedented in the speed at which information can be controlled and the ability of those who own the means to control them. I think that that is also quite different in the times that we're living. I do not have a suggestion for a counterbalance because sadly, my work was mostly leading up to periods of conflict that didn't end well. But again, this is why there are so many gaps. Somebody else who maybe looks at, so for example, I think one big area of research that is also needed is ecosystems that didn't descend into civil conflict but had similar conditions. What were the factors and conditions present within their ecosystem that led to them not following that same path?
Next question from Rahul, actually Professor Bhargav, a colleague of ours. How does the analogy play out for parts of the information ecosystem that don't want to be studied, but we need an understanding of? Are there analogies that can help for unpermissioned methods of research on platforms that are part of the ecosystem but actively resist study?
Right. I think that they're probably, I mean, again, I'm not like, I don't know everything about all things. I haven't seen when it comes to physical ecology where that particular problem would be the exact same, except in the sense of systems that may be really difficult to analyze, like deep parts of the ocean or oceans in general. That's like one of the ecosystems that has really only had a lot more better understanding of how it functions as a system in recent decades. Um, so one is, I would say, when it comes to the information environment, two separate things. One is like different types of ecosystems. If you have a national information ecosystem like Russia, for example, that has been increasingly taking away what was once public data about that information ecosystem, it will become harder and harder to study. So finding ways to be able to do that will be increasingly challenging. I think we'd have to look towards other authoritarian states where research has been done over time. And then also, this is one of the reasons why I think we need to build up and maintain data about ecosystems over the longer term, because this can happen anywhere. And then the second thing is if you're talking about ecosystems like social media platforms, for example, which constitute, their own ecosystem within a wider one as well as a global information environment. I think in some ways, using the DSA to try to get to answers is one approach. But this is also why I think it's important to try to study the rest of the ecosystem around them to see what we can understand about it, to see what kind of changes are happening, where there may be more information or data that we can get on populations, on literacy levels, on infrastructure, et cetera, that can tell us about the surrounding system. And then from there, try to infer what we can about those smaller ecosystems within it. Again, not satisfying. I feel like this is the theme of my Q&A. Not satisfying.
These are big questions. These are big questions. And Anne, who had asked a prior question, follows up with an emphasis on the visual elements of communication. So non-textual artifacts, photos, exciting video, influencer charisma, advertising, clickbait, and suggests that it might be, a maybe a stronger element than, for example, text. And then to give an example, and says regarding the visual element in China, the rollout of blanket television in rural areas means Chinese citizens, especially the elderly who are largely illiterate, do not have to read. So I'm just putting it out there, asking if you have a response, or we could just let it sit.
No, I mean, I think that is right. Literacy is definitely not the only way to measure skill levels. It's one that has been important in different ecosystems in time, and I think it does still matter, because there are different ways in which we process information. But in countries like Nigeria, for example, where not just video but voice notes are heavily used, there is less of a dependency on literacy. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that we do need to find whatever those factors might be. So, what are the other ways in which we can understand how humans process information, or assess their level of processing information based on whatever kinds of information that they're being exposed to, whether that is watching television or having to read something. We do need to find these types of things to be able to understand the state of ecosystems globally.
Edward asks, education now spans both humans and AI. Human information informs AI, which then informs humans, thereby creating an almost instant feedback system. Added instant reinforcement. Is this, however, any different from the domination of religion in the past, which reinforced beliefs? How do you measure such forces which bias the population, and is it different today from from that past? Are there past examples where such bias is compensated through some form of education?
I mean, education. Okay, back up. Before the Reformation, education was completely, at least in Europe, controlled mainly by the Catholic Church. And to go and get an education, even in England, you would be going to a monastery or something like that in order to become literate. So a very small percentage of people were being taught. Um, then, as more public education gets brought in England, for example, that was actually done to compensate for the closure of the monasteries by Henry VIII, as well as the godly wanting to teach people. So there was already an inherent bias. So there, every time we are taught to process information, there is this potential that how we're being taught to do this will create a bias, which for me is why we have to constantly consider the various ways in which people are getting their information, because even if they're presented with something that may be very factually accurate based on science, depending on what their life experiences have been, could lead them to process that information in faulty ways. How do you measure these things? I don't know if I have an answer for every factor for how you measure that, but I think that these are areas that we have to look at trying to figure out how to study those processes over a longer term and then how they relate to people making decisions. Hi, Rebecca.
Yeah, and Rebecca is weighing in, but I will also just voice the comment from our several time questioner commentator Anne, who says, "Thank you so much. You are brilliant." We
Thanks,
agree. We
Anne.
agree. On to Rebecca, Professor Tromble. Alicia, you've led conversations around the globe about how we might improve researchers' cooperation to examine these important issues. What do you see as the greatest barriers to such efforts at the moment? And has that changed in the current geopolitical environment? Easy questions from Professor Trump.
Well, I mean, I don't have one specific one that, and that will not surprise Rebecca that I'm going to say that. I think th that we're facing many, right? I mean, one that is definitely making things more pressing is the changing geopolitical environment. It is going to, or at least it seems to be, killing or hurting research that was already, you know, maybe not the best funded in the world. So I think that that is going to increasingly put pressure on. And then the question is how many other countries kind of fall in similar ways that will also have a knock-on effect. I think ever has been the challenge is funding in research, and the funding model that drives it is rather problematic, especially when most of the research ends up being project to project. So that hurts our ability to have longitudinal analysis or studies that are a little bit more systemic or bringing things together. There also wasn't a lot of funding to actually convene researchers in ways over the long time. I mean, we might get money for ad hoc, like a research workshop, but that doesn't necessarily create the level of cooperation that's required for, you know, a systemic kind of approach to study an information ecosystem. I think down the list, but still important, is the fact that we all come from very different disciplines and we all kind of have our own language for explaining these things. So we might not actually be talking about the same things in the same ways, which makes it really hard to then bring those different types of research together. I think that that's something that we have to work on overcoming. So there's a lot. And then, of course, as Rebecca knows well, data access has been a general challenge, and not just on social media, although that tends to be a really big one. And I think we're going to have the same black box kind of problem when it comes to AI, but also just in terms of, you know, different levels of research on different countries. The US has been blessed in the past for having a lot more data than other countries, but this tends to also just be a challenge, like even on understanding who owns infrastructure in a country, for example, or tracking media closures and consolidations over time. That varies from country to country.
Next question from Chad. Seeing as both of your Prussians, by which I assume he means those you've cited in your
They
remarks,
were, yes.
yeah, Clausewitz and
Not
Humboldt,
intended.
those Prussians ultimately lean towards war, ecological collapse as the end result of imbalance. Do you feel there are particular bellwether data points you see or would like to see that indicate approaching points of no return?
That's a really good question.
It is.
Um, and I don't know. I mean, I do think that every time we introduce a new technology that really changes how information is processed and distributed within, 15 to 25 years, I think that it's pretty clear that we'll see some sort of a destabilization, even if that country was pretty, solid. Um, I'm worried that analysis of things like polarization, by the time you see it as being a problem, it's already too late. Like we're already on a path towards something that may not be recoverable. So maybe earlier warning signs on that. And again, that would be somebody who studies polarization would have a better answer than I would, but that might be it. I do think that there's some sort of connection between the state of democracy and the state of news media. So, what kinds of media are available to people, and also maybe what they're turning to. One thing I've been wondering about is I'm sure everybody remembers like Google Trends and Google News trends from way back when. So it's clearly possible that we could see in maybe not like at an individual level, but an aggregate level, what kinds of websites and platforms and like say channels on YouTube are being watched as they're coming up, as opposed to having to find out that they already have, a significant or massive audience. So I wonder if things like that may be more available to us going forward.
I'd love to interject a question here. We have about 5 minutes left. I know, Alicia, you and your colleagues at Carnegie were writing about Mark Carney's, the Prime Minister of Canada's important speech at Davos, and I was trying to think about. I mean, he wasn't necessarily talking about the information ecosystem, but there's a sort of intriguing extrapolation, perhaps, from his remarks, which is that middle powers, sort of countries like Canada, who you suggested are seeing a kind of infection to some degree by um, lower quality sources or propaganda or whatever you want to call it. Um, is there a possibility of various kinds of like information coalitions that would form? And I don't even know what that would mean exactly. But I don't know, firewalls or attempts to build transnational media systems that would attempt to wall off certain undesirable elements. Just sort of thinking aloud, what does sort of his thesis mean for information?
That's a great question. Because I don't think that Carney's speech was directly related to like the information environment or the Canadian national information ecosystem, or even some of his approaches that was not his approaches, but his government's approaches towards like digital sovereignty. So that's been the big topic up here is like cloud sovereignty, AI sovereignty, and like funding quantum to have like separate Canadian initiatives that are, relying our dependence on American technology and services. That has been mostly discussed in very much piecemeal. So like singular technology and lots of money is going into it without necessarily a wider consideration for like other aspects that may impact greater unsovereignty, like who owns our newspapers and what is Alberta listening to these days? Nobody knows. So I don't think that that's quite where the thinking is at. However, there are ways to, I think, scale up alternatives. So, for example, if social media is the thing that everybody's worried about, is it possible for a bunch of middle-sized countries, and I think Blue Sky is a good example of it not necessarily costing that much to come up with alternatives. I think the catch here is that if you're going to do that, then whatever that new system is, you're going to have like data portability because people aren't going to move if they can't take their stuff with them. You're going to have functional comparability, like it has to be what they were achieving and getting before. You may have to introduce other reasons for people to be on it. So, for example, is this some way in which people can access public services or things like this? Like, how can it be constructed that people would want or need to have to use it? And then, if you build that in a way with other middle countries, then you kind of have a localized but interoperable or interconnected with other countries, but it, works with legal rules and stuff within that country. So I think that's one way. There's also been discussion around helping us get off of dependencies for satellite and critical services
Oh, wow.
because we don't have our own like internet satellite service provider. So Starlink has been coming in. We can't actually, I think, still launch our own satellites either. So that's the kind of level of cooperation that's been coming up. One thing I would add to that is I'm not sure that firewalls and control of information is necessarily the answer here. That can backfire pretty quickly, especially anything that comes down to an idea or content level, because by the time it's a problem in an ecosystem, it's in the minds of people, and then it becomes really easily politicized by different actors, which is a case in Canada as it is everywhere else.
Final question, as we reach the end. This is actually from one of the co-founders of the series, Professor Bryony Swire Thompson, who asks, from your perspective, how does the lack of a standardized definition for information ecosystem impact interdisciplinary communication? And then we'll wrap up.
Well, one, it becomes really hard just to even do basic things like literature reviews because the media studies people have framed it in terms of media ecosystems, media ecology. And so if your search terms at a basic level aren't capturing that nuance, you may not actually be able to pick that stuff up. So one is that I think that we're actually operating in our own kind of silos or ecosystems, as it were. That means that we don't get out of those silos to understand one another or see how our work fits in. I think that on a wider scale, there's issues with not understanding the system that hold us back from being able to prove things like causation or really be able to understand how we can foster better conditions within that ecosystem that might be pulling on a variety of different interventions that can be made. There's, other ways that aren't coming to me off the top of my head, sadly.
Well, we want to thank you for a wonderful talk and spirited set of responses to a great set of questions. Thanks to the audience for being here, and we have a recording too, so hopefully there'll be a long tail on this content. And Alicia, what are you working on? Are you working on another book or anything? Uh,
Actually, we are currently working on assessing national information ecosystems. So that is one thing we've started with Canada.
yeah,
So trying to see, we have from that paper that I shared,
yeah.
there is another book idea painfully dancing around in my head.
Okay, good. Well, we look forward to it, and everyone should go buy the information animal. Thank you so much, and thanks for coming. We have some more speakers. I put some information in the chat here, but you can also go to our website or to Harvard Shorenstein's website. And thanks to those folks at Shorenstein for co-sponsoring the series. Okay, take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.